Well, thank you very much. Welcome to the Pacific Northwest. So we just saw in the video some of the greatest opportunities and some of the greatest challenges facing higher education today. The video speaks to the fact that today's student, the vast majority of today's student, their experience of college is different than I imagine the majority of us, our experience was. They're not enrolling in college at age 18 in a full-time residential program, graduating 4 years later without debt. And the video speaks to the fact that for these students, for this new majority, obtaining a college credential, it's the ticket into the middle class. It provides them with the critical thinking and communication and other skills that they need to pursue their dreams, to sustain their families, and to achieve their goals. And the video speaks to the fact that colleges and universities today require bold, visionary, creative, innovative leaders. Leaders like Cheryl Hyman in the video. Leaders who are able to transform the colleges that serve so many of us so well so that they serve the students who make up our new majority. I am delighted to be on this stage with leaders like Cheryl Hyman. Karen Stout is president of Achieving the Dream and formerly president of Montgomery Community College in Pennsylvania, and Mark Becker, who is president of Georgia State University. So thank you, and welcome both. So I want to look back and talk about the progress that we've made in higher education, some of which was referenced in the video. As you may know, the Gates Foundation launched its higher education program in 2008, 7 years ago. And it's interesting to me that focusing on the success of the students like Sherry and in the new majority. And it's interesting to me that, 2008, the completion agenda, which we're all bought into, was still pretty much a novelty item. It was still being debated and discussed. And now it's front and center in the practice and policy of higher education. So as you look back, Mark, why don't we begin with you? As you look back over that period of time, what's the progress that you're seeing, particularly for students in this new majority?
Well, what I'm most excited about is, and Bill Gates referred to this, there are points of light for success. Over that period of time, we've actually seen a few universities, including my own university, where we've actually eliminated all the gaps in retention and graduation rates based on race, ethnicity, or income. Now, we haven't hit that at a national level, but there are points of light. We have the data. We have examples of programs that work. So that's what's most exciting. And that work at our university started about 2008. So I think the time frame is exactly right.
And Karen, same question.
What's interesting, Sherry's story is really not unique. And maybe in 2008, many of us thought her story was unique. I mean, our students are moving from major to major, from career aspiration to career aspiration. And I think we're increasingly aware that our colleges are not structured and designed to help students navigate through them, and unless they come with some type of background about what college is and mentors and support along the way. So I think just that we have in the last 8 years changed our frame of thinking about the way that our colleges are designed. In the community college area, there's been significant progress in redesigning the way we approach developmental education. And we've referred earlier today to developmental math and math preparedness. And perhaps that's where I think community colleges have made the greatest strides, where we've accelerated delivery, we've contextualized delivery, but most importantly, developmental education is now taught not as a standalone kind of an effort, but it's connected to some type of college-level course and/or career pathway. And Cheryl Hyman referred to that important connection to careers. I also think we are moving past this early, temptation to try new interventions in a pilot way, in a boutique way is what I would call them on my campus at Montgomery. And we know now that we have to think about design in scale. And that means that interventions have to either be universal, meaning they touch every student in our colleges, or they're scaled to the particular target group that we're trying to reach. So there are two types of scale, and I think while it is a struggle, we're seeing more progress there. And lastly, I'd say that there's just much more awareness in community colleges that while access is in our DNA, and I hope remains in our DNA, success is just as important.
Yeah. Actually, I want to pursue some of the progress. We've had DevEd, we've had Pathways, some of the interventions. I mean, the interesting thing, again, to me, as I look back to 2007, 2008, we're still debating why students are dropping out and where along the way they're dropping out. And here we are in 2015. I think it's reasonably well known what the loss points are. And we're beginning to see across the community some real coalescence around a relatively small number of interventions that do actually make a difference in shoring up these loss points. Karen, you've mentioned DevEd and sort of highly structured pathways. Mark, anything from your experience at GSU or across the university systems stand out as being?
Well, actually, I want to build on much of what Karen said and reflect back to what Bill and Melinda said, is data are critical. That we actually have to do, the interventions that we launch have to basically be evaluated, and not in a boutique fashion, but at scale. And so, you know, the approach that we're seeing that is successful at institution across institutions is they actually know what their data are. They use it to design interventions. They may test them on a small scale, but then they go to large scale when they work. And it, you know, it was less than 4 years ago when we started talking about some of our results, and people would just say, you had to be lying. We don't believe it because nobody has ever been successful. So the other problem, and I think the reason that this frustration, if you're reflecting, is that we have an idea of the different types of interventions that work, whether it's whole new ways of doing advising, using data to inform advising, whether it's peer-to-peer mentoring of students, whether it's taking your low performance classes, many of which are mathematics, but not exclusively, moving to a more adaptive learning or hybrid learning environment, all those things. There is still a tyranny of low expectations within universities. The students who have not succeeded, there's a mindset among some people, well, they're just not going to. And that's a barrier for all of us.
Yeah. Can I actually explore just a little bit what it means to take any one of these interventions from pilot to scale? My experience at the University of California was that the pilot is actually a safe mode of innovation. It's when it's when that innovation moves beyond the pilot phase that things begin to happen and can be somehow dragged back to actually take a step back.
On the ground, you're absolutely right. At Montgomery, we were one of the early Achieving the Dream colleges, which is one of the reasons I'm now leading up Achieving the Dream. I'm a big believer in the discipline that Achieving the Dream brought to the institution around using data and building engagement and creating safe spaces for pilots. They're great ways to get faculty engaged. The real challenge, and I think we're still facing this challenge as we move into this next decade of reform, is how to move from pilot to scale when we know that something works. And it just requires turning the flywheel even faster on what we're learning from a pilot. So getting data in the hands of faculty. I'm surprised that we are so far along in this movement, and we're just beginning, I think, at least from an Achieving the Dream perspective, to understand the important role that faculty have in having a voice on scale. We can't scale on campuses, especially in the teaching and learning space, without large faculty involvement, no matter what the data says about how important an initiative is. And the other thing that we're finding with advising and just scaling what we know about what works in advising are resources to help to put the people to the technology. I think the colleges are, it's easier to find dollars to help invest in technology. It's harder to find the dollars to invest in the people that makes the technology go. And I think those are two barriers to further scaling: faculty engagement and just the investment in the people resources, or the reallocation, being brave as a leader to reallocate where you know something will work, and to stop something that doesn't work.
I think this is a critically important piece. It's technology and people. It's not an or, it's an and. That's the only way we can succeed at scale. And I actually want to give a shout out to my Chancellor, Hank Huckabee, who's here on the front table, because he actually made an investment in our program. We went out and bought the software and the technology, and through our annual budgeting process, we got the resources from the system for additional advisors. Without those advisors, the technology would not be successful. Yeah. But the advisors need the technology to do their work better. I'm talking about an advising system where a cadre of about 60 advisors had 42,000 face-to-face meetings from among our 25,000 undergraduate students a few years ago. Now that change was a substantial change. It took a lot of power away from deans, but it was the data that made the story. I mean, when the deans pushed back and said, well, we want control. Those are our students. We want to blah, 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 blah. And we basically said, the data say you're not successful. And the data, and we're not going to accept low results. We're not going to accept low performance. We're going to do better. And so I think it's using the data, getting the people, getting the technology together, and then having an unwavering vision and commitment to our students.
So it's interesting. If again you look back to 2008 and the extent of the extent to which we've come so far, if you're looking forward into the next 7 years, next 8 years, what are the biggest looming challenges, continuing challenges? We've talked about faculty. We've talked about continuing use of data. Are there others out there on the horizon that you see building to scale? Are there others out there on the horizon that you see having to tackle in that time frame?
I like to use the word alignment as one of the big opportunities for the future, and something that I think is a concrete action item from the conversations we're having. And that is alignment in the work of all of us that are engaged in this reform movement. So many of us have so many ideas, and finally it appears that the ideas are coalescing. And being able to speak in an aligned way to the field about what we know about what works is essential now, because my philosophy or a big assumption is that we know a lot more about what we need to do, but what we need now is support in the how and the who. And the field really needs now the community, public investors and private investors, to help support the colleges in moving forward with the technical assistance that they need to move in the direction that we know from evidence works.
I'm going to give two answers. One's at the very specific at the institution level, and then the next is the national level. The next big thing for us is actually to take everything that we've learned about advising with students and move into their financial lives, financial advising, using the data that we have available. Because the reality is a very low-income student, 60% of our students are Pell Grant eligible, which means their families are making less than $30,000 a year, which is literally impossible to live on in this country, but somehow they manage. They have, between Pell Grants, the Hope Scholarship Program, which the state of Georgia has, other financial resources, the resources to start an education and to make progress. But it turns out these are people that aren't used to managing money, have never had any before, and it's actually, there's a lot of complex rules about it. So how do we get better at helping them manage their financial lives in an advising system that is just-in-time delivery with the right people doing the right things? And being able to do that, again, at scale. And the reason that's so important is a student is 7 times more likely to drop out of our university for financial reasons than academic. Mm-hmm. That is still the big piece that pushes students out of higher education, is the ability just to be able to afford it and stay on schedule. So that's the big one. I think at the national level, the big piece is actually showing that not only what we can do at scale within institutions will be done at scale across institutions. Mm-hmm. Rather than everybody, when there's a disease in higher education, which is we all have to invent it for ourselves. We always want to be able to talk about what we did at our university. The press release is always about us at a specific institution, is being able to take these results that we're seeing, whether it's at community colleges, in high schools, middle schools, elementary schools, or universities, and be able to ramp up much more quickly than has been the history.
So these are pretty audacious challenges. They exist at the system level. Our data suggests that unless we really act now, our colleges and universities are going to be producing maybe 11 million fewer credentials than our economy is going to require in 2025. They suggest that unless we act now, college and university will become a barrier to social mobility, a reproducer of privilege in this country, as opposed to something that can help to close the attainment and equity gap. So what gives you optimism that going forward over that next 7 or 8 years, we can sort of pull off some of these local and then national systemic changes? Karen, why don't we?
Well, I think what gives me optimism is the whole movement around using data to make improvements, that has taken hold, and that more and more of our colleges have the ability to use data and understand it, and that we're beginning to get that data in the hands of faculty so that faculty can make adjustments real time in the teaching and learning environment. And the promise now of learning analytics and real-time opportunities for faculty to see what students are doing and make adjustments along the way. So I have a lot of optimism because of that. I also think that we're beginning to build on some of the early investments that Gates and others have made in developmental education redesign, that has then led to thinking about pathways through our institutions, and we're seeing more whole college attempts at reform. I'm optimistic because more and more boards of trustees are understanding the challenges that presidents face in leading institutions through this type of change. And we know, and I think this was mentioned earlier, that leadership really does matter, and the longevity of leaders at our institutions is important in order to see through and shepherd and steward these changes. So having boards that understand that challenge, that's an important thing, and I'm optimistic about that. One thing I didn't say about, I'm optimistic because the data shows in the community college area aggregately that we are beginning to move the needle in every milestone area around student progression nationally, including completion. What worries me, and Mark mentioned this, and his institution is a model, and that gives me optimism because there are pioneers out there that we can follow and learn from. But in the community college area, when you look at that data, students of color and low-income students are falling further behind. And I've been visiting colleges and showing those charts, and that's really daunting, and that's chronic. So learning from emerging models gives me optimism as well.
My first point of optimism is the breadth with which there is commitment to actually solving these problems. Not only individual universities and colleges that are committed to this, we have many, actually a majority of governors have signed on to Complete College America. They've made it a state priority that's bipartisan. We've got major foundations, with Gates being a leader, that have made this a priority and making a major commitment to it. Our major associations at the national level for universities have identified this as a priority and have reinforced the work with their programming. They're creating and issuing awards for institutions that are successful. And then at the federal level with the First in the World initiative of significant commitment to evidence-based work. So that at the national level, everything is aligned as a priority. I mean, this is not a Democrat or a Republican issue. It's not a liberal or conservative issue. This is a national issue. At the demonstration project level, what most excites me is a project called the University Innovation Alliance, which Gates Foundation is a generous supporter, where you've got 11 large public universities that historically would spend all their time competing with each other, have agreed to share their data, open their books, to actually take programs that have been shown to work within an institution and actually do the experiments to show that you can replicate those models at the other 10 universities, covering almost the entire geography of this country. This is a pioneering effort to actually go the opposite direction of these sort of not invented here phenomena, and basically say that we're going to share data, we're going to share practices, and we're going to see if we can actually show that this work scales across institutions as well as within.
That's great. So represented in this room, we have higher ed leaders, we have folks from the policy arena, we have folks representing employer groups, faith-based groups, philanthropies. What advice can you give them? What can they do tomorrow or Friday or next Monday when they wake up and they go into their day jobs to help us move this agenda forward? Karen.
Well, I think we know more now than we did 8 years ago, that change really there needs to be an ecosystem approach to change. So no matter, and from a community college perspective, we're very community-based. And we've placed a lot of the responsibility for improvement inside the community colleges, when we know too that communities need to be involved. So as I think about this, and I think about the connection for a pathway, and go back to Sherry's story, there was a community that supported her through that pathway. And I think mobilizing and figuring out how to be part of that community, either on your campuses or your community at large, is very important. The strength of a community college really is based on the strength of the community-based organizations that provide the non-academic supports that our students need, the employers who help from the very beginning in helping to design programs that are relevant and later helping to employ students, and the transfer universities who are so important in helping us to design our programs so that students do not lose credits, so that students can economically make their way through our community colleges into a transfer situation. So I would just ask that you think more in an ecosystem kind of way, and that we think about aligning public and private, state, local, and federal resources in a more strategic way to really mobilize this work.
That's great. Mark?
I think as you interact with the education leaders in your communities, whether it be on boards or at associations or alumni organizations or whatever, that you actually ask for the data, ask for the results, because there's a propensity in higher ed to tell the story of one student. And the videos are great, but everybody can do that. The question is, what do the data say? Secondarily, ask what the commitment is to scale, not to do you have a program from left-handed shot putters from north of the Arctic, but do you have a program for all your students? Because that's how you're going to actually get the substantive change. And then to stick with it, not to follow the flavor of the month or the fad of the month, to stay focused on the dream, achieving the dream, which is that everybody in this country has a level playing field and a fair chance to get an education, so they can do that for themselves, for their families, and for the good of this country.
So we're moving into the lightning bonus round. Clock says we don't have yes or no answers only. So you are both fabulous leaders. Montgomery and GSU are two institutions we constantly refer to as exemplary of what can possibly be done in higher education today in this country to meet the equity and economic development needs that we talk about. How long does it take? You mentioned stay the course. What's the course look like to a leader?
Well, I was at Montgomery for 14 and a half years, and the journey continues. There are still, I can tick off the things that still need to happen to keep Montgomery moving forward. So it's a long journey. I mean, I know that's sobering news, but it is a long journey. I do see, though, the tipping point. I think we've reached a tipping point. I really do. Just in looking at the data, I think most of us are poised now to really accelerate our work around completion.
Mark?
I agree with that up to the point that as you get closer and further and further up that curve, the next gain, the next percent gets harder and harder.
It's harder.
You know, so it took us 10 years roughly in round numbers to go from a 32% six-year graduation rate to a 54% six-year graduation rate. And if you include transfers, students that transfer somewhere else and graduate, 65%. So 30% higher than the national average, but still 35% short of 100%, which is where it should be. That next 35%, it's probably going to be a good decade.
So the gains are harder to win, but it looks to me, at least as I read your stories and know about your institutions, that the actual pace of change is quickening, not slowing down.
Well, and I think by the commitment of, if you will, at the national level and others buying in and taking part, I think nationally in terms of moving the needle, which I think is where both of us are focused, is moving the national needle, I think we can actually see those results in the next 5 years.
You're both great leaders, so our fastest lightning round. Who inspires you to do what you do? I'll tell you mine is Professor Michael Katz, University of Pennsylvania, told us that you must bring academic rigor and analysis to causes of social justice.
Mine was my fifth grade elementary school teacher, Mr. Moore, who saw in me a lot of uniqueness, and he fed my interest in history, my interest in athletics, and just in a very personal way figured out a way to mobilize my curiosity around learning. And I still think about Mr. Moore as well as many of the teachers that I had. He was doing personalized learning before the technology started to do the personalized learning.
Mark?
And for me, it'd be high school math teacher, Miss Walgamuth. I had her for 3 high school math classes. And the reason is, if it wasn't for her, I probably wouldn't have even gone to college and been successful. I didn't want to go to college. I started at a community college, not knowing what I could do and what I'd be able to do. But she actually refused in every math class I had with her to not achieve my potential. I mean, she would actually make me do more than the other students did. And I would say, well, why are you giving me extra homework or making me do harder problems? And as she said, because you can. And refusing to let me underachieve was the greatest gift she could have given me.
Well, thanks to them, and thanks to you for everything both of you do for this.
Thank you.
Okay.